Hi guys, this is Ben from Airline2Sim, and it's great to be back with one of our famous first look videos. This is where we will see in action for the very first time the inBuild Simulations A300-600R. Now, you might be thinking, hey, inSimulations, are they the guys that do the repaints and fix airports when the developers vanish and leave them broken? Yeah, you'd be right. And this is their very first add-on aircraft release. Now, you might be wondering, how can a team who've never developed an aeroplane before come up with something that is at least as good as what we already have in X-Plane, let alone better or as good as the stuff that we would see from the established developers from P3D, people like Majestic Software, PMDG, Flight Sim Labs, and others. Is that even possible? Is this the aircraft that finally moves along the game for X-Plane 11? So, for people like me that really like X-Plane, and I have to say, the more I use X-Plane, the more I love it. I love the lighting, I love the atmosphere, I love the texture of it, and when you add in ortho scenery and true earth, X-Plane does provide a truly amazing experience. And now that it's running with the Vulkan API, it gives you a kind of smoothness that I just have never seen in the ESP platforms. Now, of course, it's a little bit too early to see what's going to happen with our new simulator on the block, Microsoft Flight Simulator. But I genuinely believe that X-Plane 11 and, of course, X-Plane 12 is now in the works, still has an awful lot to offer the simmer. But the one thing that's always been missing is a really excellent add-on aeroplane. And the IXCG 737, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan, and it comes very close, but it still just has a few little bugs and quirks that make it sometimes a little bit tiresome. Is this the aircraft that can finally change the game for X-Plane 11? Is this the aircraft that brings what we would call the P3D study level quality to X-Plane 11? That's what we will discover in this video. So stay here and find out. So of course, this is Airline2Sim, and it wouldn't be a first look video if we didn't talk to somebody who actually flew this aeroplane in real life. And we have Captain Eric Girardey, who flew the A300 for Monarch for almost 20 years. Welcome to Airline2Sim, Eric. It's nice to have you here. Now, how does the A300 compare to, say, the more modern Airbus A320 models that we may well be familiar with in the sim?
Look at the 320 and the later generation Airbuses. They are certainly a lot more user-friendly in the sense that if you're going to be stuck in an aircraft doing 700 or 800 or 900 hours or even 1,000 hours a year, the 320 is a lot more user-friendly. It's a lot less noisy, but the 300 was the real pilot's aeroplane. It was more complicated in the sense that you had to understand the systems, but it was very rewarding when everything went okay. It was absolutely superb. It's a very, very satisfying airplane as a pilot's airplane. And I have friends who've flown the 7.5 and the 7.6 and will say, again, the 7.5 and the 7.6 were simpler to operate and probably a lot more user-friendly, but once again, they didn't feel quite so smooth to actually hand fly when you wanted to hand fly.
Now, here's a question for you. They tell me that at Monarch, the A300 was called Miss Piggy. Is that correct?
It was called Miss Piggy because we had an absolutely legendary captain on the fleet. He went from the 757 to the A300, and on his conversion training, he had a good look at the aircraft, and he went, "She's fat, she's French, she's Miss Piggy," and the name stuck. And he used to introduce the airplane as Miss Piggy to his crew. He used to warmly greet her as he got on board. So whenever people came in from different backgrounds during the ground school, I used to also introduce the aircraft as Miss Piggy, and the name stuck because she was friendly, fat, and French, and that was it.
So was it a bit temperamental? You know, was it a bit moody sometimes? A bit like Miss Piggy?
Yeah, they could be, because they're Airbuses, and so there's a lot of computers that don't like the cold and they don't like sitting. So for instance, which they had at Gatwick when the weather was pretty crummy and damp and humid and cold, they would throw wobblers. But any kind of Airbus will do that to you. The 300 was more so than others, largely because of its age.
So what was the worst thing about the A300? Perhaps something that really wasn't very good?
Yeah, the flight deck was extremely noisy because of the avionics cooling, and the later Airbuses have got liquid crystal display screens, but these ones were the old TV screens, and they were quite hungry for power, and they heated up quite a lot. So there was an awful lot of fan noise going on in the cockpit to the point where, most of us always complain that our hearing isn't up to scratch after 20 years on type, or even 15 years on type. That was one of the greatest drawbacks with it. The flight deck was also smaller than on a 320. But it's actually smaller because you're more further into the pointy end, and because there's no flight engineer, and it wasn't designed to have a crew rest area in the flight deck such as in a 330. It's actually quite a cramped environment. If you've ever been on the jump seat of an A300, you'll remember it's not a comfortable place to be. So the flight deck was a little bit claustrophobic at time. I suppose the 747 guys will tell you the same thing. Huge airplane, very small flight deck, because that doesn't generate revenue.
So I guess now, coming in to fly this aircraft in the sim, we probably need to know about some of the most well-known A300 Gotchas, things that can really bite us on the backside if we get them wrong. What would you say are the A300 Gotchas?
Well, the one we've been discussing in the past, and I used to warn people on the ground school, was on the go-round. The aircraft, having underslung engines, and fairly powerful ones, will pitch up a significant amount, and you have to physically stop him doing so. So you've got to push. And then the initial reaction, especially with this so much power on these things, if you're not that heavy, it just scares the shit out of you. Even with the autopilot engaged. I mean, there was a freighter crew some years back in Germany that managed to overspeed the aircraft. They were hand flying a go-around, and they were so scared that they pushed so hard that they actually were level for a bit at about 700 feet over the runway. And of course, the aircraft drove itself through pretty much every flap limit that they had. It will accelerate really well. It would drive itself into the barber's pole quite happily in profile mode, VNAV for the Boeing boys. Be aware of the vertical speed, and any time there is some kind of TCAS traffic, just not hesitate to go into vertical speed.
So really, it's a pretty overpowered aircraft, right? I mean, why on earth does it have such big engines? That doesn't really make sense.
No, the 600R was their answer to trying to make it a bit more of a long-haul airplane by giving it another 5 tons of fuel to put in the back. But I think the idea was that the CF6 engines were available. And nowadays, the engine makers will talk to the airplane makers, and they're pretty much matched to the frame. Whereas in those days, you didn't have that much choice of engines. And that was sort of the choice. So I think, and that's my opinion, the CF6 was designed with airplanes that operated at higher altitudes, such as the 747 and the 76. The 300, by virtue of its little wings, couldn't go very high. So of course, the thrust margin at cruise, at optimal cruise level, was always way more than sufficient for what you wanted to do.
I think the one thing that I noticed is that it's a bit of a mishmash between kind of Boeing and Airbus. It's a bit of both, right?
It is a mishmash because it was designed at a time where people that flew airliners flew mainly Boeing, Lockheed, and that was pretty much it, or Douglas. So they had to have modes that were recognizable to people transitioning from these aircraft. The 320 was the first one where they threw the rule book out the window and said, well, this is how we're going to fly the airplane. But in the in that world, when the 300 appeared, they still had to have things that people recognize. So we have level change, and profile is the equivalent of VNAV on a Boeing. On the modern Airbuses, when you are in managed mode, the aircraft will maintain the constraints that are published in the database for your departure, for instance. On the 300-600, the constraints are not taken into account if you're in profile climb.
Now, the A320, we leave the auto thrust in when we're hand flying the aeroplane. Is it the same thing with the A300, or do you take it out and do the thrust manually?
No, I mean, Monarch used to have this SOP that if you were in manual flight, you were also in manual thrust. And the aircraft responded very well to manual thrust. You had full control of it, and it was actually a lot easier to hand fly, or to at least manage the thrust on an A300 than it is to manage the manual thrust on the 320, because the 320 was never really designed to be operated manual thrust on a regular basis.
Now, if you're coming again from the A320, you're used to not having to trim the aircraft because it has auto trim and it does that for you. Do you need to trim the A300 yourself? It won't do it automatically, right?
You do. The actual aeroplane has got a much friendlier trim system than the 737, for instance. In the 737, you really got to know what you're doing, because sometimes you trim a bit too much and also all of a sudden something happens which is not what you want. The 300 trim was extremely progressive. It had different rates depending on whether the flaps were out or not. So that's one to remember. But it was extremely good to trim. It was really, really nice to trim. But yeah, you had to remember to trim it. And of course, pitch and power went side by side. So you had to realize that if you put a bunch of power, the aircraft's nose was going to go up and you're going to have to push forward and trim it forward until you had what you wanted.
Now, let's talk about the age of the aeroplane, because it's really old and it has these old style kind of CRT screens like you would get in an 80s TV. Is it true that the FMC, it has about 500 kilobytes of memory, less than a megabyte, 1 meg of memory?
Probably, because if it's anything like the FMSs, I personally have rescued one of the FMS trainers that we had at Monarch, and that was feeding off a floppy disk. So yes, one said that there was more memory in a Furby than there was in the entire FMS system on the Airbus. We didn't have enough memory available for us to fly worldwide. So whenever we were flying, if the aircraft had been operated in the European EU Med theatre and we were going to America, we had to make sure the engineers had loaded the America, sort of the West database, because there was not enough memory otherwise, and it would take 40 minutes to load each FMGC or each FMS.
I think one other thing that might confuse people is that on the navigation display, there are no curves. So even if you have a SID and perhaps it has a nice curve to join maybe a radial or something like that, the navigation display will draw it in a straight line, because this aeroplane, it simply couldn't draw curves, right?
Yeah, it was down to technology. Basically, they worked like an Etch-a-Sketch, and you know, it was very good at straight lines, but not very good at anything else. The aircraft will fly things like an arc if they're programmed to do it, but the actual display of it won't be showing it. I mean, the departures out of Gatwick, the Dover 8 Mike, that one, which is a nice curved turn to intercept one of the radial from Detling. On the nav display, it will look like a square, but the actual aircraft will. But it doesn't fly it as a square; it flies it as a nice, perfect circle.
Staying with the Autopilot, can we trust the VNAV in this? Obviously, it has those kind of managed modes, managed climb and managed descent. Can we trust the profile, or as you would say for the A320, the managed mode in this aircraft?
I wouldn't trust it too much, because it's nowhere near as clever as the 320 system. Nowhere near, and probably not as clever as what the guys on the 734 and 800s have. So yeah, you just we used to just think for ourselves most of the time. We try and play with it occasionally, especially the guys who knew they were going to get upgraded to the 320, and they thought, we'll play it like an Airbus, and then eventually they'd give up. and go back to flying it like an airplane with level change and vertical speed.
Let's talk about the end of the line for the A300. You were there, obviously, right till the very end. I guess they were pretty old and well used by the end, right?
Yes, I mean, we were probably the third operator that put the most hours on it, but we were just slightly less in terms of utilization, but we had a lot more sectors on them. So yes, they were quite well used. They'd been well maintained for their years, but towards the end, the financial aspects of maintaining them had got on top of the company, and the company didn't have that much cash, so he was really desperate to get rid of them. And the engineers we had were superb. We had some guys that knew the aircraft like the back of their hands, and if you gave them a good diagnostics, they would say, I know, because this aircraft wasn't as easy to diagnose as this 320, which could tell you exactly what failed. The 300, like the older cars, will not tell you exactly what it is and will leave it to your deductive skills to figure out what's wrong.
And those final flights, when they went one by one off to the boneyard, was it a bit like taking a kind of beloved family, sick dog or something to the vet to be put down? Was it that kind of emotion?
Yes, it was like that. And even people that were high up in the company, our former chief pilot, who actually did the last commercial flight, and there's a good video knocking about on YouTube about that one. But he took the first one to Tupelo, Mississippi, where it was going to be demolished, and he felt very emotional on arrival, and he didn't mind telling us that. I could have bid for a trip, and there was a bit of a bun fight. People liked the idea of going there, and I just refused to even bid, so I didn't do any of the last flights. I just had my own last flight and then kissed it goodbye and went. But it was, I think most of us felt a loss, and most people still feel a loss when we think about our 300s. I know they couldn't have gone on forever, but we had a lot of affection for it because it was more than a machine. It had its own temperament. It felt more like an animal than a simple machine, and I think these beasties they had a character of their own.
Now, all of them went to Mississippi and they were just crushed. But the final Monarch A300 went to France, where a company that's linked with Airbus actually recycle the aluminium and keep the specific kind of aviation grade aluminium and make it back into new aircraft. So there's a chance that some bits of the very final A300 are once again in the skies in maybe an A320 or an A350 or something like that.
It could be, and that's why I felt better about that one rather the other two got mixed into and probably ended up as beer cans and pieces of automotive trim. But it's still, a brutal way of ending the life of the machine. But still, at least it's not a waste like when they come up with an excavator like they do out in Mississippi and everywhere on the west side of the world.
Let's have some final thoughts about Monarch. Everyone was very sad when it finally went bust. It had been around for 50 years. What are your thoughts about your time at Monarch?
Well, Monarch was a lovely company. It was old-fashioned in the way that it had grown from the heady days of the British aviation industry, but the training, the quality of the training, the atmosphere between the crews, we're all like a family. You'd go on a trip, and Monarch was like this. The problem is that towards the end, the finances didn't make sense. To run a company like this, you needed investment and you needed a forward vision, and that was at the end. I think when we got sold to the venture capital, that was pretty much the end, and we knew we had a couple of years, and we would have made it. We were 4 months short of 50 years. I think we went on in October, and I think we'd have celebrated 50 years in February or March. So it was a very sad day for the aviation industry when Monarch went.
And listen, Eric, it's been great to have you here. Thank you so much for answering these questions for us. Finally, some thoughts on this particular simulation of the A300. You saw me fly it really badly yesterday and got a chance to see my shoddy piloting skills. What do you think of the aeroplane itself?
Well, I was amazed how good the rendition of the cockpit was. But on the whole, the quality of the displays, down to individual switches being exactly right, lights that came on when you wanted them, the preset function, for instance, on the FCU speed, everything, the most minute details were there, and I was back in it. I was actually amazed how much I remembered of it after 6 years of flying the little ones, and B, how good this particular flight deck simulation was.
Well, we will wait and see. It gets the thumbs up from you, Eric, and it's been really good. Thank you so much for coming on the video with us today and telling about your time on the A300. Thank you so much, Eric.